Hello, I'm Mark Stubbs, a former member of the Idaho legislature. Even as a practicing lawyer, I never had the opportunity to take a close look at the process by which we propose and ratify amendments to the United States Constitution. You probably have not had to do so either until now. When I did examine the process, I learned some startling things. America has come dangerously close to requiring Congress to call a convention for proposing amendments to the Constitution. If only a handful of additional state legislatures apply to Congress for a convention, the machinery of a convention will be set in motion. Once this machinery has begun to operate, as former Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court Warren Burger has written, it will be too late to stop it. There is still time to step back from the brink of a convention, but it will require your attention and your action. To help preserve the system of government and the guarantees of personal liberties which we all enjoy and which we sadly have come to take for granted, please give your closest attention to this message which Mark Bork has presented just for state legislators.
When the founders wrote the Constitution, they devoted all of Article 5 to the process of amendments. Two separate and distinct methods of proposing amendments to that Constitution were provided. Those proposed by Congress and those proposed by a special convention called for the purpose. Throughout the history of America, all amendments to the Constitution have been proposed by Congress. The convention method of amendment has never been used. What is an Article 5 convention anyway? Congress must call a constitutional convention, commonly called a con-con, when the legislatures of 2/3 of the states apply for one. Once the critical mass of 34 states has applied, Congress has no choice in the matter. The convention has to be called. The role of state legislatures in amending the United States Constitution is very limited. As a legislator, you have broad powers to deal with matters pertaining to the laws and the governing of your state. But your powers in the process of amending the federal Constitution are of a different kind. The Constitution grants powers to state legislatures to do something which is beyond the usual scope of their authority. The power to set in motion a process which can change the supreme law of the land. This extraordinary power is limited to the precise wording in Article 5. Let's take a close look at Article 5. As a legislator, you are given the powers to apply to Congress to call a convention, if you deem one to be necessary. But you are given no power to decide what topics the convention will consider. No power to write the desired amendment or amendments, and no power to say that the application is ineffective if a convention might violate any restrictions and limitations which you may want to include in your application. Article 5 clearly gives the power to propose amendments exclusively to the convention. This is explicit in the wording of the article, which sets up a three-step process. Step 1. The legislatures of the states apply to Congress to call a convention. Step 2. Congress calls the convention while deciding other details, such as where the convention may meet, how delegates are to be paid, and how much, how many delegates there will be, and how they are chosen. Note that nothing in the Constitution requires nor guarantees that delegates to a con-con will be elected by the people. Congress is given a free hand to determine the method of selecting these delegates. Congress itself could choose to make the appointment of delegates. Congress could provide that the state legislatures appoint delegates. In short, Congress is given a blank check to determine how convention delegates are to be chosen. It could provide for their election, but it is not required that they do so. Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Arthur Goldberg, has warned the nation that this absence of any guarantee of electing delegates could put the convention within the control of special interest groups. writing for the Miami Herald, he stated, quote, "The absence of any mechanism to ensure representative selection of delegates could put a runaway convention in the hands of single-issue groups whose self-interest may be contrary to our national well-being." Ending the quote. Congress also has the power to determine how many delegates each state will have. But note again, the Constitution does not guarantee that every state is entitled to at least one delegate. Step 3. The call is for a convention for proposing amendments to the Constitution. This language clearly states that only the convention is authorized to determine how many amendments will be proposed and what subjects will be addressed in those amendments. During the first 100 years of the Republic, applications for a convention did not try to tell the convention which amendments to propose. That is, they were general calls for a convention. These early applications left the determination of the content of the amendments to the convention which would propose them. In these early years, state legislators knew and respected the fact that only the convention could decide what amendments would say. As time passed, the state legislators of America lost sight of the clear language of the Constitution. Later, they attempted to dictate to a convention what amendments it could propose. They did this by stating in their applications that they sought only a limited convention with authority to propose an amendment on a single subject. By issuing single-issue applications, legislatures sought to turn an Article V convention into a rubber-stamp body, a body which could do only what the applications allowed. These unenforceable limitations defied the intended purpose of the convention, which was to deliberate and decide what amendments, if any, it would propose. The wording of Article V even authorizes a convention to meet and decide that it will propose no amendments whatever and simply adjourn, if that is what the delegates want. Or if the delegates decide that some changes in the Constitution are in order, they and only they are empowered to determine the number and content of the amendments. This is a far cry from the crippled convention which would be created if state legislatures could dictate to the convention what it must do. What happens if a legislature does include in its application limitations which try to force a convention to consider only one or a few subjects? This has happened routinely in our more recent history. The most recent movement for a con has been dressed up as a movement to require Congress to call a convention for the limited purpose of proposing an amendment requiring a balanced federal budget. Other applications have sought a convention only to propose amendments to ban flag burning, to ban abortion, to establish term limits, to let states decide the apportionment of their legislative districts, and many other topics. The topics to which a convention is to be limited are always designed to be appealing. America's leading jurists and legal scholars, however, agree that legislatures have no authority to tell a convention what subjects it will address in a convention. United States Supreme Court justices and the nation's leading legal scholars have written privately that these single subject limitations cannot be enforced. That if a convention is called, it will be free to propose any kind and number of amendments to the same effect as if the limitations in the applications did not exist. In other words, although the applications are effective, all such limitations must be ignored. Chief Justice of the United States Warren Burger wrote, quote, "I have also repeatedly given my opinion that there is no effective way to limit or muzzle the actions of a constitutional convention. The convention could make its own rules and set its own agenda. Congress might try to limit the convention to one amendment or to one issue, but there is no way to assure that the convention would obey. After a convention is convened, it will be too late to stop the convention if we don't like its agenda." Ending of quote. Chief Justice Burger has issued a stern warning. Nobody tells a con what to do. Its powers to propose amendments are unlimited. In light of this information, does America, do you really want to risk a convention? As we will explore later, the risk of a convention is far greater than commonly understood. Chief Justice Burger continues saying, quote, "Whatever gain might be hoped for from a new constitutional convention could not be worth the risk involved. A new convention could plunge our nation into constitutional confusion and confrontation at every turn, with no assurance that focus would be on the subject needing attention. I have discouraged the idea of a constitutional convention, and I am glad to see states rescinding their previous resolutions requesting a convention. In these bicentennial years, we should be celebrating its long life, not challenging its very existence." Ending the quote. How great is the risk of a convention, either intended or inadvertent? At one point in time, 32 of the required 34 states had applied to call a convention. They had used the unenforceable requirement that only a balanced budget amendment be addressed. Since then, 3 states have rescinded their applications. Legislators in these rescinding states came to realize that they had applied for a convention only with a vague understanding of the convention process, but with a firm desire to balance the federal budget. They came to realize the dangers inherent in any convention only after the nation's most eminent legal scholars began to reveal the dangers involved. The fact that many state legislatures have included the unenforceable single-issue limitations in their applications shows a pervasive lack of understanding by legislators of their role and powers in seeking an Article 5 convention. So long as any applications remain in effect, there is a danger of either an intended or an inadvertent convention. It is for this reason that Chief Justice Burger was pleased to see states withdrawing their applications. Similar views come from Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Arthur J. Goldberg, who said, quote, "As we look forward to celebrate the bicentennial of the Constitution, a few people have asked, why not another constitutional convention? I would respond by saying that one of the most serious problems Article 5 poses is a runaway convention. There is no enforceable mechanism to prevent a convention from reporting out wholesale changes to our Constitution and Bill of Rights. Moreover, the absence of any mechanism to ensure representative selection of delegates could put a runaway convention in the hands of single-issue groups whose self-interest may be contrary to our national well-being." There ends the quote. Justice Goldberg is not the only eminent legal scholar to be concerned about a runaway convention. Rex E. Lee, former law school professor and later president of Brigham Young University, has written, quote, "In short, if the question is whether a runaway convention is assured, the answer is no. But if the question is whether it is a real and serious possibility, the answer is yes." In our history, we have only one experience with a constitutional convention, and while the end result was good, the convention itself was a definite runaway. Ending the quote. Of the same mind is Charles Allen Wright, professor of law at the University of Texas at Austin. He writes, quote, "I feel quite certain that even opening the door to the possibility of a constitutional convention would be a tragedy for the country." Ending the quote. In addressing the ineffectiveness of any legislature trying to limit a convention to a balanced budget amendment, Christopher Brown, professor of law at the University of Maryland, writes, quote, "In my view, the plurality of amendments opens the door to constitutional change far beyond merely requiring a balanced federal budget." End of quote. The harshest criticism of using the convention method of amendment to require a balanced federal budget comes from Gerald Gunther, professor of law at Stanford University. After reviewing the political intrigue involved in seeking resolutions for such a convention, he writes, quote, "There is no denying the fact if the present balanced budget convention campaign succeeds in eliciting the necessary applications from 34 state legislatures, the convention call will be triggered by inadequately considered state applications. For the vast preponderance of the legislative applications rest on an entire absence of consideration of the risk of a convention rout. In my view, that constitutes a palpable misuse of the Article 5 convention process. The convention route, as I have said, is legitimate when deliberately and knowingly invoked. The ongoing campaign, by contrast, has produced a situation where inattentive, ignorant, at times cynically manipulated state legislative action threatens to trigger a congressional convention call. I cannot support so irresponsible an invocation of constitutional processes." Ending the quote. Later, Professor Gunther also wrote, quote, "The fear that a constitutional convention could become a runaway convention and propose wholesale changes in our Constitution is by no means unfounded. Rather, this broad view of the authority of a convention reflects the consensus of most constitutional scholars who have commented on the issue." There ends the quote. Bluntly put, Professor Gunther declares that state legislators have applied to Congress for a balanced budget convention without knowing what they are doing, having been misled and manipulated by special interest lobbyists. A small minority of legal scholars believe that a single-issue convention can be called. To support their position, con proponents point to these scholars and ignore the majority view. But the very existence of such a substantial diversity of opinion among these scholars renders the dangers of a convention very real. Con proponents have been unable to mount a successful challenge to the overpowering logic of the majority view that a con cannot be limited to a single issue. Driven by desperation, they have attacked the integrity of these scholars by accusing them of bias. They falsely accuse them of intellectual dishonesty, claiming that the scholars are opposed to a balanced federal budget because they fear losing federal grants to themselves and their universities. The abject silliness of this argument is instantaneously apparent. There are no reports of any scholar or university having lost any of their grants in the process of balancing the budget. Applications for a convention are serious business, only to be used if the legislature believes that the present Constitution is structurally flawed and in need of repair. An unbalanced federal budget is not the result of a constitutional flaw. It is the result of a Congress which refused to obey constitutional restraints upon its spending of federal funds. Also remember, there are no guarantees of what the convention might produce. Applications are not tools of blackmail or power politics to be used to force Congress into doing something. The risks are enormous, and the possible benefits have never been established. Threatening to use a constitutional convention to secure a balanced budget amendment from Congress is like using a thermonuclear device to destroy an iceberg. If you can bring yourself to the preposterous position of saying, well, yes, we did have a runaway convention in 1787, but it can't ever happen again, please first consider these additional remarks of Stanford Law School professor Gunther. Quote, "A convention once called would be in the same position as the only other convention of this kind that we have had in our history. The 1787 Constitutional Convention that proposed the Constitution that we live under today and whose bicentennial we celebrated so recently. The Philadelphia Convention, too, was in effect a runaway convention." Ending the quote. You and your colleagues have come to depend upon certain national organizations which have a history of providing helpful information and technical assistance about a variety of topics concerning state government. Chief among them are the National Taxpayers Union, the National Tax Limitation Committee, and the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC. They have developed a level of credibility with you because of your ongoing association with them. When these organizations support a balanced budget convention and claim only to want a balanced budget and not a convention, it is easy to want to believe them. The core of their statements in hearings before legislatures around the nation is, quote, "Don't worry, a runaway convention is impossible," closing the quote. It can be hard to doubt their claims and representations in light of their past helpfulness. However, that helpfulness in other areas of state government cannot justify their position in resisting rescission of con-con applications in light of the crushing weight of legal opinion concerning the dangers created by leaving these applications in an active condition. The issue was handled superbly by Rex E. Lee, former president of Brigham Young University and a former member of the law school faculty at that institution. He had received a letter of inquiry from a member of the Utah legislature concerning the scope of authority which an Article 5 convention would have. He stated, quote, "This is in response to your letter on December 12th, in which you asked for my opinion concerning whether under Article 5 of the United States Constitution, a constitutional convention called to consider a particular issue could be limited either by congressional directive or otherwise to that single issue. The only safe statement that could be made on this subject is that no one knows. But the only relevant precedent would indicate that the convention could not be so limited. Anyone who purports to express a definitive view on this subject is either deluded or deluding." Ending the quote. We are tempted to ask why such well-established organizations as the National Taxpayers Union, the National Tax Limitation Committee, and ALEC continue to advocate a convention which puts our Constitution in jeopardy. While no one can look into the mind of another man, one answer seems most probable. They have spent a great deal of time, money, and attention in their quest for a balanced federal budget. When they focused upon using a con-con as the remedy, the dangers of such a convention had not been disclosed fully. America's best legal minds had not yet considered the issue and revealed the deadly perils inherent in the supposed remedy. It is not easy to admit that you are wrong, and it is more difficult yet to flush the time, money, and effort which have already been expended on the project. Once having set a course on a path based upon error, it is easier to continue on that path than to reverse course. This is particularly true for organizations such as these, which have solicited money from the public on the pretext of fixing the budget problem by using a constitutional convention. An about-face on this issue runs the risk of losing public support, public confidence, and financial contributions on an issue which has little public understanding. If the American public truly knew of the jeopardy which a convention poses to the Constitution, there is no doubt that the people of America would demand no constitutional convention. Convention advocates have touted the ratification process for amendments as an adequate safety net to prevent adoption of bad amendments. They claim that there is no danger of a constitutional convention having the authority to change the Constitution. All it can do is propose amendments. It cannot enact them, they assert. They place total reliance on a great safety net called ratification. Any amendments proposed by a convention must go to the states for ratification, they have erroneously claimed. Remember that the ratification process was not sufficient to stop the runaway convention which met in 1787. Fortunately, that convention gave us the superb document which we call the United States Constitution. But the delegates were called to meet in Philadelphia for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation and reporting to Congress and the several legislatures such alterations and provisions therein. Yet it did not take the delegates long to assume upon themselves more powers than what they had been given, to scrap the Articles of Confederation and to propose a totally different system of government. As they finished their work, they faced a serious problem. The Articles of Confederation were still in full force and effect. Any amendments to that document had to be ratified by the Congress as well as by each and every one of the legislatures of the 13 states. The founders knew the politics of their day. It was impossible. To overcome the problem, they agreed to ignore the clear requirements of the law under which they operated. They rewrote the rules of ratification so that the chances of approval were improved. They provided that 9 states were sufficient to put the new Constitution into effect. And since the founders anticipated resistance to ratification in the state legislatures, they further changed the rules of ratification so that it could be accomplished in special ratifying conventions called only for that purpose. The new Constitution did not have to face hostile state legislatures in order to be approved. While the new Constitution has provided the world's best government, it was nevertheless adopted in complete disregard of the rules of ratifications which were in effect. The point is simply this: the governing rules of ratification were totally ignored and disregarded once in our history. Who can say with a straight face that it can never happen again? A new convention could rewrite the rules of ratification for a new Constitution just as it could rewrite or eliminate any other part of the Constitution as we now know it. It has already happened once. Richard B. Morris, Professor of History Emeritus, Columbia University, in his comprehensive history of the writing of our Constitution, entitled Witnesses at the Creation, wrote, quote, "The delegates at the convention were sober realists. They knew that the greatest battles lay ahead. The convention had overstepped its instructions. It had scrapped the articles instead of amending them. Having defied Congress, the convention decided to pursue what amounted to a revolutionary course by declaring the ratification by 9 states sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states, so ratifying the same. In other words, the Constitution was being submitted directly to the people through ratifying conventions. Not even Congress, which had summoned the convention, would be asked to approve its work. Still, Congress, after acrimonious debate and without endorsement or disavowal, did submit the Constitution to the state legislatures to be submitted in turn to conventions in accordance with Article 7 of the Constitution, providing that once 9 states had ratified the Constitution, it would go into effect between the affirming states." There ends the quote. Among the assurances offered by convention advocates that bad amendments can't happen is their claim that Congress can refuse to send what they call unauthorized amendments out for ratification. This claim is too silly to receive much consideration. Unauthorized by whom? There is no such thing as an unauthorized amendment. Once a convention is called, it is authorized to propose whatever it chooses. If anyone offers you this foolish argument, ask him to show you where in the Constitution Congress is given the power to withhold an amendment proposed by a convention from the ratification process. No such power exists. It is a creation by the same spin artists who have created the other myths and misconceptions about the so-called limited power of a con-con. Another of the spin artists' claims is that the Supreme Court can strike down any proposed amendment which exceeds a convention's authority. This is as asinine as the previous one. It wrongly assumes the existence of such a thing as an unauthorized amendment. 2 Supreme Court justices quoted above have said that there is no such thing. Need we say more? If this argument is offered to you, it is easy to ask where in the Constitution this power is given. It isn't. Imagine yourself as a state legislator in 1787 who voted to send delegates to the Philadelphia Convention. In voting to send them, you helped place limits upon their power. They could only propose changes in the Articles of Confederation. They have no power to abolish them. Believing that these limits are effective, you vote eagerly to send the delegates. After all, you reason if we don't like the work product of the convention, we can refuse to ratify it, especially since Congress and every state legislature must agree. It clearly says so in Article 13 of the Articles of Confederation. Much to your surprise, you are wrong on both points. The convention violates its instructions by writing a new constitution. To compound the surprise, you never had an opportunity to approve or disapprove of the new Constitution on the floor of your legislature. Separate bodies met in the several states to consider ratification because the convention changed the rules of ratification, also without authority to do so, and the usurpation of authority prevailed. Our Constitution, unlike the Articles of Confederation, is not a failure. It works well when its provisions are observed, and it needs no revision. Even under the current ratification procedures in Article 5, if they are not changed by a newly sitting convention, a legislature is not guaranteed to have a proposed amendment come before it for ratification. Take the example of the 21st Amendment, which was adopted to repeal prohibition. The last state completing ratification was Utah, a state whose political and religious demographics made it the least likely to approve the repeal of prohibition. There is little likelihood that the Utah legislature would have approved the repeal if it had been given an opportunity to vote on it. But the Utah legislature never got to consider the amendment. Congress proposed the 21st Amendment and provided that it would be ratified by conventions assembled in the states for that purpose. Congress wrote the rules and created a process for selecting the delegates to ratifying conventions in each state in such a way that the delegate selection process was biased to favor the repeal, so that even in Utah, the amendment was approved. It was all done in accord with Article 5 constitutional procedures. This could happen again if a convention is called today. The proponents of a convention have used a multiplicity of tactics to get legislative support for their project. In some cases, a prominent national political figure will contact legislators in his home state, seeking their support for the convention. He always claims only to want a balanced federal budget. He urges them not to vote to rescind existing convention applications, using promises of personal political help for the state legislature. These national political figures seek and get commitments from legislators, especially key committee chairmen, to oppose the rescission measures. In some cases, the appeal is on a very personal basis, in which the national political figure will claim that a rescission of con applications will hurt him personally and politically. These appeals are tempting to many legislators. But there is more at stake than promises of personal political help and personal pleas. The integrity and the very existence of the Constitution as we know it could be in jeopardy if a convention is called. This is not hype nor mere rhetoric. It is the collective wisdom of the nation's leading judges and legal scholars. This is a time for introspection and commitment to a way of government and a way of life. It is a time to stand straight and firm to repeal all convention applications. Too many brave men and women have sacrificed too much in defense of their country and their Constitution to have it put in jeopardy by the intentional or inadvertent calling of a constitutional convention. The decision to preserve the Constitution or to leave it in the jeopardy described by Chief Justice Burger and other scholars is your decision. As a legislator, you will never make a more important one. Will you put the Constitution and principles above mere personal or political considerations? All extant applications for a con must be repealed. Please stand up for the Constitution and for America. These leading legal scholars agree. No one can mandate a limited, single-issue constitutional convention.